am Rabbi Michael Bernholtz from Temple Beth Shalom in Vero Beach, Florida. And it is wonderful that you are able to join us this afternoon. All right, I guess it's my afternoon. Not everybody has the same afternoon. For the second week of our Counting the Omer, this exploration of our Jewish people's transformation. This is one of a number of different collaborations that rabbis from small congregations have been doing since the beginning of the pandemic. It started with a Tikkun Leil Shavuot, and we have had Purim programs and Hanukkah programs and Tisha B'Av programs. And last year we had this on the Counting the Omer, where each week of the Omer we would stop for an opportunity to learn with different pairs of rabbis. And so if you would like more information about these collaborations, I will put my email in the chat. I also have all the registration from folks, and I will be glad to follow up. We're glad that we're able to offer these programs. I'm joined this afternoon by one of my classmates. We were ordained together almost 21 years ago. And in fact, Rabbi Wing and I sat together in my kitchen. She was working on her laptop and I was working on my computer, and we got our theses written and were able to be ordained. And it's one of those things that I share with our students, remind me that sometimes we get by with a little help from our friends. And so Rabbi Wing is one of those friends for me, and it is so awesome we get a chance to teach together. And I'm gonna give her a chance to introduce herself.
So I'm Rabbi Bina Wing. I am the rabbi in Rockford, Illinois, and Rabbi Bernholtz and I actually go back even farther than that because we were in Jerusalem together. We were in our Jerusalem class, and I believe we were in the same Hebrew Kitta as well. So this goes all the way back to 1996, I think. So.
Yes.
So coming up on 30 years of knowing one another, but it's really great to be able to teach together and to learn from each other as well.
So welcome everyone. I'm just swapping the spotlight. And so if you want to keep it on gallery mode, you can. If you want to keep it on speaker mode, you certainly can. Rabbi Wing and I will go back and forth as we are teaching our way through Ezra and Nehemiah. As we are teaching, if you have questions, there's a few different ways to ask those questions. One is to use the chat function. That is a great way to put a question out there to us to be able to see. Another option is to use the raise hand function, which actually is a great way for us to see because it'll put you forward on the screen to let us know that you have a question. And the third option is the wave hand function. Which is only a bit of a challenge because it means that we have to, it is dependent on us actually seeing you to be able to do that. We do ask that you do stay muted while we're presenting until we get a chance to identify you to ask the question, because that will help with background noise and other things. Because I was just on a call in a meeting and somebody had chickens, and it was great to hear the little chickens chirping, but that could be a little hard in a group like this. So if you could stay muted, you're welcome to keep your cameras on, but don't feel necessarily the need to do that. A couple of things I would like to do first is to acknowledge the counting of the Omer. We are in this period of time as we are going from our experiences in Egypt to the freedom of our people. Yes. Give me 1 second with that question. We are. And Rabbi Wing, if you can also watch that would be wonderful, the participants list.
Got it.
We are in that journey between our people leaving Egypt and going to Sinai. It's a period of 50 days, of 7 weeks, 7 days and 7 weeks. And so we have a ritual that we do called the counting of the Omer, which acknowledges as we move through that period of time and space. And so you'll see on your screen, I'm now prepared to fulfill the positive mitzvah of the counting of the Omer, just as is written in the Torah. And from the day on which you bring the sheaf of the wave offering The day after the day of rest, you shall count off 7 weeks. They must be complete. Until the day after the 7th week, you should count 50 days. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech olam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sirata omer. Praised are you, Adonai our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us through mitzvot and commands us to count the omer. And today is actually the 13th day of the omer, which is 1 day and 6 weeks in the omer. And so we are making that journey. We're just in the beginning. We're about to get to the 2nd week of it. And as you can see, this week is Rabbi Wing and I teaching Ezra and Nehemiah. Next week will be Ecclesiastes with Rabbi Isaacs and Rabbi Griffel, two Indiana rabbis. And so as we go through each of these weeks, we'll have opportunities to see these different the different books of prophets and of writings. As we are preparing for study together, one of the things I do like to do is acknowledge the power and why we're gathered together for study. Elu devarim she'en lahem shi'or, she'adam ochel perotehem bo'olam hazeh, v'hakeren kayemet lo le'olam haba, ve'elu ehen. These are the things we do in our lifetime that make this world a better place and will be remembered about us after we have died. They are Kibud av va'em, honor your father and mother, Ugmilut chasadim, do acts of love and kindness, V'hashkamat beit hamidrash, shacharit ve'arvit, attend the house of study morning and night, V'haknasat orchim, welcome guests in your home, Uvikor cholim, visit the sick, V'haknasat kala, celebrate with a bride and groom, Uvayat hameh, pay respects when someone dies, V'yun tefillah, pray to the best of your ability, V'hava'at shalom bein adam lechavero, make peace when people disagree, the Talmud Torah keneged kulam, and realize that the study of Torah is equal to them all, because by studying Torah, we learn how, when, and why to do all of these things. And the blessing for study. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We bless you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who make us holy through mitzvot and command us to pay attention to soak in these words of Torah. So we are not just studying this for the sake of learning about Ezra and Nehemiah. We are doing this as a way of connecting with the divine, of learning about these books of Torah, but also doing this together to have an opportunity to learn and grow together. So Rabbi Wing and I are going to kind of go back and forth. I'm going to share a little bit in
terms of his faith as Aaron after his children.
Not sure what happened there. But we're go back and forth through some of the different themes of the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. This is coming from Ketuvim. So this is coming from writings. It's one of the last books of the Hebrew Bible. And last week you talked about Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Psalms. This week we're looking at Ezra and Nehemiah. Last week with Ecclesiastes, or with Proverbs and Psalms, you get poetry or little pieces of wisdom or different sayings that you'll have. That is a very different type of book from Ezra and Nehemiah. These are narrative. They are telling a story, and they are sharing with us the story of what happened in the wake of the victory of the Persians over the Babylonians. Remember that in 586 before the Christian era, the Babylonians destroy the first temple, and they take many of the leaders of Judea and Benjamin into, and the remnants of the other 10 tribes, into exile in Babylonia, which is now present-day Iraq. When the Persians, who are coming out of Iran, and in fact, what language do they speak in Iran? They speak Farsi. And if you think about Farsi and Pei and Fei in Hebrew, Farsi, Persian. Persia was Iran. When the Persians defeat the Babylonians, Darius, who is the leader of Persia, says that the Jews, the Israelites, the Judeans at this point, are able to go back and rebuild their temple. And so Ezra and Nehemiah are part of the chronicles of that. We're going to talk about some of those details. This is one of the only windows we have into this period of time. We're talking about 23 books total between the two. This is one of the few windows we have into that period of time, of knowing what was really going on. And we're, of course, only getting it from the perspective of the Bible relating to us, the perspectives of Ezra and Nehemiah. One of the things to realize is that you have a few different layers. One of them is no one's sure who really wrote it. Is it one writer? Is it two writers? Who are these different, who are Ezra and Nehemiah, both as characters of the book, but also who's putting together this book? There's all kinds of questions there are all kinds of questions we're going to see about timing. Does Ezra, in the Hebrew Bible, Ezra comes first and Nehemiah comes second? Well, maybe it's actually Nehemiah was there earlier and Ezra's a later accounting. There's different discussions about who is first, who is last, and how it's all put together. So as we're reading these, they're questions, right? Do we try to understand the historicity of the when, where, and the who? Who is Ezra? Who is Nehemiah? Who are these characters? When are the books written and when are the events they're talking about? There is some theories that it's actually written 100 years later, but it's talking and looking at a period of time around this, the return from exile. Do we look at, did these things really happen? Do we have archaeologists that go back to try to find the walls, for example, that Nehemiah built? Do we try to figure out how did this book come together and how much history is it telling us? Or, and this is one of those questions, we don't do that with Torah. We sometimes do that. You get documentary hypothesis. You sometimes get where we try to say, did the Bible, Torah really happen? But there's another interesting switch that we do in Judaism saying, I don't know whether the crossing of the Sea of Reeds really happened or not. I can't prove that it did, but I'm going to assume and live as if it did. And what does it teach me about being a better human being and about building a better community? And so that's part of it. As we are reading Ezra and Nehemiah, we're going to talk about some of the history, but we're also going to talk about some of the different values, about some of the morals, about some of the different paradigms about Jewish community that come out of this. And Rabbi Wing graciously shared with me some of her notes, and it's great because there's this discussion of which came first, Ezra and Nehemiah, and all of the article is beautiful because it argues, it says that here are the reasons why Nehemiah came first, and then you have the other side of why Ezra came first. One of the questions I'm going to ask, and I am curious, you're welcome to chat, how many cups of wine are there as part of the Passover service, Passover Seder? How many cups of wine? Okay, Marilyn's got fingers up for, I can only see a few screens just because of how my screen is set up. So feel free to chat that number. I've got 4 so far. I've got 5 from Joanne. Any other thoughts? Yep, Colleen, go ahead.
6.
You say 6. So Colleen, what are the 6?
Okay, the first 4, the Elijah cup, and the Miriam cup.
So Miriam is interesting. Usually it's a cup of water because Miriam's connected to
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right.
That's a fair answer. So everyone's giving 5. But if you look in a Seder, and Colleen, thank you for being willing to speak up. If you actually look at the Seder, we talk about 4 cups of wine. We don't talk about 5 cups of wine. But all of you are saying 5 cups of wine. And then Colleen's threw in Elijah's cup. And that's part of Judaism. Realize that our tradition says there are 4 cups, 1 wine, Kiddush. I love it. Thank you, Patricia. So, and that's what our tradition does. If you have the best of our artifacts, the best of our text always have more than one answer. And the more answers you see, the more you can be sure no one really knows. or you can say that the rabbis are offering us different approaches. And we're going to see that through some of our text as we are going through. With the Seder, there are 4 proclamations of God's redemption, but the rabbis are saying there might be a 5th. So we have 4 cups of wine plus Elijah. We're covering all of our bases. Another issue, who is calling us? Is that call, that motivation internal or external? We'll see a couple of different examples. And how much permission or support do we need from external sources? And that's going to be a running theme. I know Rabbi Wing is going to speak about that quite a bit, because that becomes a huge issue in Ezra and Nehemiah. So just so we can see, Ezra is fulfilling a proclamation of the king, that it was the God said to the king of Persia, go let those people go. And the king of Persia says to Ezra, go build the temple in Jerusalem. Nehemiah, and I want you to note the month of Kislev in the 20th year. So we're now getting some date, some timing. And he is in the fortress of Shushan. Again, from here, we're now locating him in something connected to the Esther story. And he is a wine steward in Persia, and he's miserable. And he gets the attention of the king. The king sees he's miserable and says, what do we do? And he says, I was in the fortress. I asked them about the Jews, and the survivors who survived the captivity in the provinces are in dire distress. I sat and I wept. I was in mourning for days, fasting and praying. God of heaven, great and awesome God who stays faithful with those in his commandments, let your ear be attentive, right? So he is saying, God, what do I do? What do I do? And the king says, why are you miserable? And the king says, what is your request? Echoing very much the same kind of stuff Ahasuerus and Esther. And Nehemiah says, it would make me happy if you send me on an expedition to go back to Judea to build the temple. And so you've got 2 different kinds of motivation. Ezra is getting a directive from the king. Nehemiah is responding to an internal thing of how he feels and what he wants to do, and seeks permission of the king. I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Wing and let her share the next piece.
Okay, so so one of the things that that I think is interesting, that I'll just sort of add on to what Rabbi Bernholtz says, is that, you know, we study the Torah and sometimes don't realize what's the next part of the story. And so if you go into then Joshua and Judges and Kings and Samuel and Kings, and then you get to Kings, and it's sort of like, where do we go next? And Ezra and Nehemiah is really the next part of the story. So so you end up having more of a narrative. So I'm going to cover kind of an interesting part of Ezra and Nehemiah that I think sometimes we tend to overlook it. So there are a lot of name lists in Ezra and Nehemiah. And so this is some of this information is based on an article that you see the title of here. And so what are the different name lists in these 2 books? So as Rabbi Bernholtz said, there's 13 chapters in the 2 books, or sorry, 23 chapters in the 2 books together. So in Ezra chapter 2, there's a whole list of people who returned to the land with the 2 leaders, Zerubbabel and Joshua. Then in Ezra chapter 8, there's a whole list of people who came with Ezra. Ezra chapter 10, the people who terminated their intermarriages. We'll talk about intermarriage and that whole thing, because it comes up in 2 different places, both in Ezra and Nehemiah. And then Nehemiah in chapter 3, there's a list of everyone who built the walls of the city. In chapter 7, there's a repetition basically of Ezra 2 with some minor differences. And then chapters 11 and 12, those who settled in Jerusalem. So what is the problem with these name lists? So it seems to us to interrupt the flow of their narrative. So it's seemingly not very interesting. Even 2,000 years ago, the ancient historian Josephus wrote, "But I've thought it better not to give a list of the names of the families, lest I detract the minds of my readers from the connection of events and make the narrative difficult for them to follow." And I'll just say that my Torah study group studied these books verse by verse by verse, and I have to admit that that we didn't really pick up on sort of the significance of the name list. And sometimes while we would literally go verse by verse, sometimes we would just skip entire passages of these name lists. So it's worth noting that some of the discomfort is the changing tastes of the modern reader, including ourselves, rather than the ancient readers who were fond of the lists and who were the target audience of much of the text. And so the ancient readers saw them as a kind of poetry and saw them as sort of celebratory notes that would elevate the text from what they saw as sort of routine narrative. So I'm going to take a couple minutes and go through each of these lists and what they might reveal. So the first list, I think, requires sort of the longest intro, and then some of them, the other ones, much less. So the first list in chapter 2. So we get the impression that a large number of Jews returned. So the focus is on the people. So Tamara Cohen Eskenazi, who is a biblical scholar, she writes, "The people who will build the house of God are the central focus of the book. It is these people whose story Ezra Nehemiah narrates." So contrast that with Ezra Nehemiah with the detail about construction and dedication found in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and First Kings. Again, in these books, the focus is on the people rather than the structure. And in fact, it's worth noting that the dedication of the structure in Ezra is about 3 verses long versus what we see in other places. So in addition, the list conveys an optimism which may not have been the reality. So when we look at these lists and lists and lists, we're given the impression that throngs of people heeded the call. No sins are recorded. The returnees are committed to building the temple and want to jump into the work right away. It almost feels like the fulfillment of prophetic redemption that was predicted before the fall, before the exile. The reality is that the majority of Jews stayed in Babylonia. And we know this because the Babylonian community of Jews continues to thrive. When we even look at the Talmud, it's the Babylonian Talmud that is the main one that we reference. So the majority of people didn't come back. And in some ways, you might draw that to the parallel of the state of Israel. When the state of Israel was established, I think there was a sense, oh, everyone's going to go there. All the Jews of the world are going to go there. And a lot of people said no. And of course, this was centuries between things, whereas there was only about, let's say, 60, 70 years between the exile and when Cyrus lets them come back. But even still, 60 years is a long time. And a lot of people said, we're good in Babylonia. And they didn't go back. So the list was such that each person who did return could be named. So they knew who each person was. Thus, the list could be understood as kind of a blurring of joy and disappointment, which is similar to the reaction of the people when they saw the rebuilt temple in Ezra. And we'll come back to this passage actually in a little bit, but many of the priests and Levites and the chiefs of the clans, the old men who had seen the first house, wept loudly at the sight of the founding of this house. Many others shouted joyously at the top of their voices. The people could not distinguish from the shouts of joy from the people's weeping, which could be heard from afar. So that's the first of the list. And so then the second list is from chapter 8. And these are the people that returned with Ezra. So the character of Ezra comes up a little bit later in the actual book of Ezra. And so again, it demonstrates the importance of people over the leadership, which in many ways characterizes Ezra's style as a whole. Ezra gets others involved in bringing the Levites to Israel. Ezra transfers most of his authority to the people. Even with the intermarriage issue, which again comes up later, Ezra waits for the people to approach him, and they arrive at the solution. And again, from Ashkenazi, the transfer of power from Ezra to the community is at the heart of this movement. So then we get to Ezra chapter 10, people who terminated their intermarriages. And again, the topic of intermarriage will come up later. So you have two differing opinions on what this list means. So Malbim, who is one of the rabbinic commentators, several centuries later, suggests that the relatively small number of people suggests that in fact there weren't that many people who had intermarried. So the list can feel both overwhelming in a literary sense, because it's like a lot to read all the names, but still faces the reality of the small size of people who terminated their marriage. So somebody might look at this list and say, well, it doesn't seem like there were that many people that ended their marriage in support of this ban on intermarriage. And so Malbim makes the argument that maybe there weren't that many people in the first place who had intermarried. But then Mordechai Zer Kavod argues the opposite, that the small number of people means that Ezra's success was limited, and that most people stayed with their non-Jewish wives. And the argument behind that is that the fact that Nehemiah also deals with intermarriage suggests that the problem of intermarriage was not completely eliminated in Ezra. And again, that makes the argument that Ezra was first, as Rabbi Bernholtz was talking about. So then we get to the lists that are in Nehemiah. It's possible that the people who were listed were just the foremen, and so maybe there were more people that participated. However, it's more likely that the list is to give the impression of fullness, similar to what we saw in Ezra 2 and 10. So here too, Zer Kavod suggests that the list indicates that most Jews did not participate in the building of the walls. This might be one reason to account for why some had to build two sections of the wall. They were short-staffed, and this comes up later as well in the text. So sometimes the lists were designed to give the impression of fullness, but the reality suggests something different. So then, chapter 7. This list is perhaps the hardest to understand because it's almost a complete repetition of Ezra 2. There's very minor differences. Nehemiah's generation find the list and they're using it for land distribution, but they could have just noticed it. They could have just noted that they were using this old list without repeating it. So Zer Kavod notes that the Bible repeats passages to accord additional merit to a certain idea. And so if that's true, then you could argue that the name lists then are the most important feature of Ezra and Nehemiah. So if the passages are repeated, if the name lists are in there to add merit, then again, the name list could be the most important feature of Ezra and Nehemiah, even though to us, it's like, why would we read that? And Ashkenazi suggests that the list in Nehemiah forms a bridge with the previous generations of the Ezra and Nehemiah narrative and refocuses the attention on the central role of people. She notes that the chapter that follows, the words "the people" or "all the people" are mentioned 13 times. So the people become the heroes of the event, not Ezra or Nehemiah. And then lastly, we have the chapters of 11 and 12, which are the listing of those who settled in Jerusalem. It's here ideally as a celebratory note, and in contrast to the earlier story where there was mixed joy and weeping, this time the joy was unadulterated instead of being mixed. It would seem that given the centrality of the nameless, that it would make sense to look at for the book to end with a name list. But instead, Nehemiah concludes with with his personal narrative, which he repeatedly gives himself credit for the religious reformation, and the rabbis are somewhat critical of him later for doing that. So then this is just a concluding thought about the nameless. It should be clear to the authors of Ezra and Nehemiah, these lists are an indispensable component of the storyline. Ezra and Nehemiah ultimately is not about its great leaders, buildings, or events as much as it is the story of a people trying to come to terms with rebuilding itself after the catastrophe of the destruction of the first temple, constructing the temple and the city walls, and taking personal initiative and responsibility in vitalizing the spiritual character of a community that had reaccepted the Torah. So that is the nameless in a nutshell. I'll hand it back to Rabbi Bernholz.
Managed to mute myself. As we transition between two different sections, are there any? I see we had a question about intermarriage. We will get to that. That is a whole significant topic here in Ezra and Nehemiah. Any questions or any comments? Anything that is catching your attention as we're talking about this? Yes, Colleen.
I'm really interested in the emphasis on the restoration of the community and the de-emphasis on individual leaders or hierarchical power structures.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, that's really at the heart of the Ezra Nehemiah story is the rebuilding not only of the structure, but the rebuilding of the community. And there's, you know, when Rabbi Bernholz and I were talking about what were we going to talk about, we sort of picked out a couple of different themes. And what we didn't really even get into, which is why we encourage you to actually go ahead and pick up Ezra and Nehemiah and read it, is that it includes a religious reformation that some credit to really being the beginning of Judaism as we know it, which includes the reading of the Torah and a lot of the rules that we follow to this day.
We'll actually get to that next. And I think you'll also see some of that in my third section where I talk about the rebuilding, how much of the text really includes everybody, that it's the people who are doing construction, it's the Levites, it's the musicians, it's the poets. And so there is that theme and vein in Ezra and Nehemiah. Joan.
Hi, I know earlier was mentioned that most people didn't go to the state of Israel, but is there a connection that people make between these texts and post-Holocaust decimation and rebuilding?
Have you heard Rabbi Wing? And we're in the midst of Yom HaShoah.
Yeah, so in the studying that I that I have done, there wasn't much of a connection that I came across in terms of commentary, but I don't see why there wouldn't be parallels to it in terms of, you know, I think we underestimate the devastation of 586 BCE in terms of what it really meant to the people. I mean, we can only imagine if, you know, God forbid, the modern state of Israel were to, you know, to be destroyed and all its leaders would be, you know, exiled. I mean, it would be horrific. And this was also true back then. So I could see that that there would be a parallel with that.
But we already had the basically modern European Jewry was decimated. And so we really did have this experience. I mean, that's what I'm asking. We really lived a similar experience of decimation of a complete civilization.
I think
Right,
part of it,
right.
Joan, is there's unfortunately, too many examples across our history. This is just one of them. And as we get into some of the other issues, there's a few different challenges that happen with it, as you'll see with intermarriage. That is one of the reasons why it doesn't get as much attention. Somebody had asked a question, does the disappointment in seeing the rebuilt temple echo disappointment in the people who returned?
I'll cover that a little
Go
bit.
ahead. Okay. And Jane,
When-
you
when-
had a question?
Yes, when you read the Torah and everything, the focus on the land of Israel is being necessary to the Jewish people's life and their religion. And obviously when they were expelled to Babylonia, they had to change their whole idea of the connection to the land of Israel and how God works outside of Israel. When Ezra and Nehemiah came back, were they trying to reinstate that idea that the land was the central thing and God was the God there? Or was there still at this point the idea that we could be a people in the diaspora and still survive?
It is interesting you should say that, because that is a perfect segue. And Jane, where are you from?
Temple of Israel in Wilmington.
Okay. So I was just as proof, we do not know each other. She is not a member of my congregation, but she has offered me a perfect segue into what I'm going to talk about next. And so let me do my share screen here. And just make sure that I can see the chat and can see participants, although they'll be in my way. So as we're talking about in the land, and out of the land, as we're talking about diaspora and in the land, and from the reading of Shema from Va'ahavta, we talk about b'shivtecha b'veitecha uv'lechtecha v'derech, right? When you sit in your house and when you go on your way. One of the things that we have here is even as they're coming back to the land, they really are establishing themselves in Jewish time. And that's one of the things that in Judaism we see, that time becomes more important than place. We can be anywhere, but what we do is we do Jewish time and remember what happened or what is happening or was happening in the land of Israel at that time we are celebrating it. And you see that here, okay? There's a mention in Nehemiah, when does he go to the king? In the month of Kislev, right? And in the month of Nisan, he stands before the king. These are Babylonian the name of months from Babylonia. They have different names in the Torah. It's only coming back from Babylonia that they're starting to use these names. And yet they're also still doing what we do to this very day of using the numbering system from the land of Israel. The land of Israel, the new year starts in the spring, okay? What's the month of spring? It's Aviv in the Exodus story. Here it's Nisan. What number month is Rosh Hashanah in, and Yom Kippur and Sukkot? It's in the month of Tishrei, but it's the 7th month. We celebrate New Year's in the 7th month, which doesn't make a lot of sense because you've got both the land of Israel time and Babylonian time, and they're finding ways to merge them. It's quite interesting here. So there are some questions. Wherever we are, we try to locate ourselves in time as much as space. And even then, they take action at a time to connect with their ancestors. We'll see that. We also, in Ezra and Nehemiah, you get this beautiful description of the rituals of Sukkot and discussion of Sukkot, and the reading of, and Ezra establishing that we're all going to get together and we're all going to read Torah. There is, by the way, a small congregation, Tikkun Leil Shavuot, that you should all look into, that very much modeling on what Ezra does here for Sukkot. So here in Ezra 3, when the seventh month arrived, what is the seventh month? It's the one we call Tishrei now. That's Rosh Hashanah, and that's the beginning of Yom Kippur. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and the beginning of Sukkot. They're locating themselves, as much as they're talking about geography, which I'll do in my last section, they're also locating themselves in time. That's when they actually set up the altar, was for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and then they celebrated the Festival of Tabernacles, the holiday of Sukkot, as is written in the daily burnt offerings in the proper quantities. They're trying to reboot in the place, but in accordance with time. And we saw that we just shifted from between Sukkot and Pesach. We say Mashiv Haruach and Morid Hagashem. We talk about the rainy season in Israel. We just flipped it now to Morid Hatal, to the dew in the Gevurot, because even in the time where we are, even if that's not the weather outside here, we want to remember and understand what it's like in Israel at that time. Here in Nehemiah, you get the month of Nisan. Nehemiah goes back, and again, the seventh month. Nisan's the spring, the beginning of the dry season. The seventh month, they don't list it here as Tishrei, but that's Tishrei. That's the beginning of the rainy season. And here you get the ritual. Ezra the priest. So this is a mention in Nehemiah of Ezra. You don't see it the other way, and they're not sure exactly where this is coming from, but here you're getting a mention of Ezra in Nehemiah. Ezra the priest brought the teaching before the congregation, men and women, and all who could listen with understanding. He read from it, facing the square before the water gate, from the first light until midday. To the men and women and those who could understand, the ears of all the people were given to the scroll of the teaching. Ezra the scribe stood in the wooden tower made for the purpose. Here's who was with him. He opened the scroll to the sight of all the people. Above all the people, as he opened it, the people stood up. Ezra blessed the eternal one, the great God, and all the people answered Amen and Amen with their hands outraised. Do any of you, when you go to a Torah reading, ever find yourself with your hand upraised while someone's holding a scroll up for you to see? Right? V'zo tatara asher. When we do Hagban Galila, you lift your hand to point at it. Here you have this from 2,500 years ago. Okay. This is just some more examples of that same. They found written in the teaching, which means, wait, we didn't know about it. That Moses had commanded them to dwell in booths during the festival of the seventh month. In Babylonia, they didn't know about this. They're now restoring that connection of this rhythm of time in the land. And the whole community returned from captivity, made booths, and dwelt in the booths. Israelites had not done so from the days of Joshua. That means even further back, their sense of time is interesting here, to that day. And there was great rejoicing. He read the scroll of the teaching of God each day, from the first to the last. They celebrated 7 days. They had a solemn gathering, you might say Shemini Atzeret, as prescribed. So here you're getting the rituals and a sense of time that we use to this very day, played out in this book 2,500 years ago. And that's been one of those themes that was going back to what Jane was talking about, is in the land versus diaspora. This has been part of the way that we have lived in diaspora, connected to the land. If you can't be in the land, keep the rhythm of what happened in that land in the place where you are. And so it's a chance to see that here in Ezra and Nehemiah, and how much it's emphasized and repeated. And I'm going to pass it off to Rabbi Wing.
Okay, so now we're going to look at the themes of undermining the efforts, resistance from within and without. So there's lots of building that is happening in both of the books. So there's the building of the foundation and sort of ideally the rebuilding of the temple, and then there's extensive building of the walls. But it's not all smooth sailing. So I'm going to just go over a couple things that you'll see. So despite the optimism at the beginning of Ezra and the return to Israel, there's many instances of resistance that occur both from within the people and also from outside people. So just a couple of examples from the outside. So in chapter 4, it begins with a request of people who are described as adversaries who ask to assist with the building. It's not clear who the adversaries are, but the assumption is that it's the Samaritans who had been living in Israel since the Jews were exiled. Their offer to help is rejected. And the sense is that there was a concern for purity and a concern that their true motivation for is to hinder the efforts rather than to help. So the rejection results in this passage from Ezra, where the people of the land undermined the resolve of the people of Judah, literally weakened their hands and made them afraid to build, literally harried them while they were building. They bribed ministers in order to thwart their plans all the years of King Cyrus until the reign of King Darius. And in the reign of Ahasuerus, they drew up an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. So they basically draw up a letter which suggests to the king that if you look at the historical records, you're going to see that this is a rebellious group. They shouldn't be allowed to rebuild. And the king responds and orders the building project to cease. So that's one example of without. And then these two characters, Sanballat and Tobiah, appear repeatedly in both books. And here they mock the Jews' building efforts. And they ask a number of questions. What are the miserable Jews doing? And this is a pretty literal translation. Will they restore, offer sacrifices, and finish in one day? Can they revive those stones out of the dust heaps, burned as they are? And then Tobiah says that stone wall they're building, if a fox climbed it, he would breach it. So you have, and that's just one example. There's other places where there's resistance from the community outside. And then there's resistance from within as well. So there's several places in Ezra where the building is ceased by royal order, but sometimes for very long periods of time. So it implies that the initial enthusiasm and energy may be dissipated. And then, as noted in the name section, when the foundation was completed, you have this sense of mixed joy. So it's not clear why there was weeping. So some say, oh, they were weeping for joy that they were able to see the day. But it was mixed with sadness when they thought about the tragic events that had led to the moment. Or that they were weeping that they would not be alive to see the finished Second Temple. But it was more likely that it was disappointment when comparing what they saw to what they knew in the past. And then another example of sort of resistance from within, in Nehemiah, you have Judah. It's written a little more poetic than I have it here, but they basically are saying our strength is gone. There's a lot of rocks and junk, and we can't do it. We're not able to build the wall. And they continue by saying, talking about their foes before we know it. Our foes are gonna come and kill us. And in addition, when Jews living near them would arrive, they would say to us 10 times, you must return to us from all places. So you have this idea that the task seems overwhelming. They're feeling threatened from their enemies. They're feeling the pressure from the Jews around them to return and protect them from the threats that they're facing and to perform the other work that needs to get done at home. So, and while there's many other examples that fall into the category of resistance from within and without, that's just to sort of give you a little snippet of a theme that kind of runs throughout the text. And now back to Rabbi Byrne.
Meant to hit add spotlight, not replace spotlight. Sorry about that, Rabbi Wing. One of the significant themes is the building and how the building happens. And as I talk about values and what do we learn from this, one of the things that you see is how the book honors everyone's contribution, that everybody is doing a share. Sometimes it's, if you can't, and you see this in Ezra, if you can't go, send money, send silver, send gold. It's that some are the artists and some are the artisans. And you also will see, you see in Ezra, this family takes this section of the wall, this family takes this section on the wall, this family works on a tower. You also see a balancing of a discussion of the balancing security with actual ritual. And it's kind of incredible to see this, as Nehemiah says, I've got to stand by a wall with the sword in one hand and work happening in the other. In our day and age, to see that happening 2,500 years ago was certainly caught my attention. And then I want to also give you a little bit of a sense of the geography of what we might know of Jerusalem geography today with the description we get. So just very quickly, I want to show you a couple of different maps. This is the kind of the Jerusalem rebuilt under Ezra and Nehemiah. This is somebody had put this together, taking the descriptions, and if you look, you'll see most of them are Nehemiah. Ezra only really we hear a description of the building of the temple building and the altar. The rest is the walls that are done by Nehemiah. And the question is raised, did the walls get built first with Nehemiah and then the temple? And that's one of the reasons why they think Nehemiah might be earlier. Or did the temple get built first and then they're rebuilding the walls around it? So that's kind of the question. And as if you have been to Paris, we were there, it took them like 20 years to build the Arc de Triomphe, if not longer. This has that same feeling. We're reading it in a compressed form and narrative, but it unspooled over many, many, many years. As you see this, you can see here's the Temple Mount, and then here is down into the city of David. What I wanted you to realize is that this is the north, this end is the north, and this is the south. This is the Temple Mount, and this is all outside of the current city walls. So if you look, here is the Temple Mount. The Western Wall Plaza is over here. The Western Wall Plaza is over here. This is the Dome of the Rock. Here's the current old city walls. What we're talking about is a city that extends to the south along this finger here. This was the city of David. Okay, so it's currently outside of the old city walls. There's been a ton of excavation there. They had just started to excavate it when Rabbi Wing and I were there in the 90s. But you can actually go into the archaeological sites now. And that's also when you get the story of David and Bathsheba. David is up here looking out over the city, and that's why he sees Bathsheba bathing on a rooftop, because she's downhill from him. Again, here's Old City. We're talking about this area right here, the city of David extending south of where the current Old City is. And I want to leave, I'm going to stop because I want to leave time for Rabbi Wing to talk about a little bit of intermarriage. We might go over an hour a bit here, folks, but I think people will want to stay for the discussion of the intermarriage stuff in Ezra and Nehemiah. But I'll stop my share.
Okay, so you'll stop your share and I will start mine again so that we can look at.
Oh, and somebody had asked about recording. If you miss a session, and I will put it right now into the chat, it's on our Temple Beth Shalom of Vero Beach YouTube channel. There will be a playlist of just these sessions, and last year's sessions has its own playlist too, if you are interested. But I will put those into the chat so you can get to that.
Okay, so dealing with intermarriage. So as noted earlier, there was a great concern for the purity in the rebuilding of the temple, which is why the offer to by the Samaritans to help with the building was rejected. And in addition, in the nameless, it's very clear who was there, whose genealogy was unclear. So there's a great concern for purity in the rebuilding of the temple and in the return to the land. So there's a traditional fear in the text there was a concern connected with intermarriage that it might lead to idol worship, which, as we know throughout the text, was a continued problem, because you keep mentioning, the text keeps mentioning the problem of idol worship, and if idol worship wasn't happening, they wouldn't need to keep bringing it up. And there's also a sense that foreign women led to Solomon's sort of theological undoing. So in addition, throughout Ezra and Nehemiah, there's a prominent separatist ideology that occurs that really is emphasizing in many different ways the need to remain separate in order to properly rebuild not only the structures, but the community. So this is Ezra's reaction when he finds out that there's a lot of intermarriage. So upon hearing about the intermarriage, Ezra rents his clothes and literally tears his hair out from his head and his beard. He then offers a long, drawn-out prayer, weeping and crying about the sinfulness of the people. And you have to imagine this sort of guilt at its best. He's saying, oh, woe is this people who have sinned in this way. And it's this long drawn out prayer, and people began to gather around him to listen. And then after he's laid on the guilt through the prayer, the leaders themselves come up with the solution that the marriages should be dissolved. Meanwhile, Ezra fasts and doesn't drink because of the faithlessness of those who intermarried while in Babylon. And everyone is given 3 days to come forth to end their marriages or face excommunication. Nehemiah's reaction, on the other hand, is whereas Ezra is doing all these things to himself, Ezra, his reaction is outward. So he's also angry, but he directs the anger at the people instead of himself. He gets angry at them, curses them, and even, according to the text, smote certain of them and plucked off their hair. So Ezra pulls out his own hair, Nehemiah pulls out their hair. In other words, Nehemiah strikes out and makes demands of the people. It's worth noting that what sets Nehemiah off is that he sees children who didn't know Hebrew, but rather only know the foreign language of their parents. So I thought that was an interesting twist.
And Rabbi Wing, I think it's also important to note that that some of the chapters in these books are actually in Aramaic. Alongside of Daniel, it's one of the only times you get that kind of use of Aramaic in the Hebrew Bible. And that's part of this, is the issues of assimilation. And when is it accommodation, when it is assimilation, and how far do you push the purity of the community before you start to break down the community by trying to have too much enforced purity, or how much times when you get the identity gets too diluted.
Right, absolutely. And one of the differences is also that Nehemiah does not dissolve existing marriages, but makes the citizens take an oath that their children would not intermarry and that they themselves would not intermarry going forward. And so just a few concluding thoughts about this issue of intermarriage, because we hear it differently, especially in our day where intermarriage is viewed much differently, and especially in the Reform movement, it's much more accepting, even within the last 30 years since Rabbi Bernholtz and I were ordained. I think when we were first ordained, if you asked members of our ordination class, would we do intermarriages, we were about 50-50 of people who would and would not. And I would imagine that has changed quite significantly. So though the Tanakh mentions opposition to intermarriage in several places, it should be noted that there was a strong antithetical view on this issue within the community of returned exiles, and that's reflected in the book of Ruth, which is one of the texts I believe that is going to be learned about as we get very close to Shavuot. Because Ruth is also included in the canon. It's evident that there were quite divergent opinions on the matter. And so I want to sort of I want to close with this quote. It's hard to imagine a more vigorous riposte to the separatism promulgated by Ezra and Nehemiah. Ruth firmly rejects any notion of an ethnic test for belonging to the community of Israel, and as in the literature of the earlier biblical period, there is an ease of movement into the community. The Book of Ruth is a luminous testimony to the tolerance and universalism that were part of the biblical heritage. So we finished at 12:03. We can open it up to some questions for either one of us or comments
And
that you might want to add.
And I've posted into the chat both the link for this year's playlist and actually last year's playlist if you want to learn about Jewish rituals. And if you send me an email, I will be glad, and I'll work with Rabbi Wing, and I can send out, if we have handouts of what we use today, to share those with anybody that's interested. Happy to do that. At least I can share mine. I'm guessing Rabbi Wing has stuff.
Yeah, I'm happy to share mine as well.
Other questions we can answer. I mean, I think part of it to realize is while you're seeing and Ezra and Nehemiah are pretty harsh about intermarriage, you all are asking questions about what happens to the divorce, why was there a forced divorce, what happens to the kids. You have that alongside of Ruth, and there's some theory that Ruth, which is set in pre-David, right? She's David's great-grandmother. They think it might even be from this time as a response to what's the language and the ideology that you see in Ezra and Nehemiah. Questions, comments, thoughts? Go ahead, Jane.
So the one question at this point, was there patrilineal descent, matrilineal descent? Were these kids considered Jewish?
I believe that they were not considered Jewish, and I'd have to go back and look at the commentary, but that in the dissolution of the marriage, that the children were often, I mean, according to the written text, that the children were also separated.
The other thing I will say is that's a really hard question to actually answer, because what they considered what Jewish means, when you start talking about maternal or paternal, had a completely different meaning in that time period, and even up until the modern era. What we're thinking about when we talk about Jewish identity was something very, very different in that day and age. Realize that even the people that were descended from the people of the tribes of Judah who were left behind in the land of Israel, when they came back, they got pushed out. So there's a huge battle going on in Ezra and Nehemiah that you're seeing between who gets to carry the mantle. And so trying to even answer of who was considering who, we are seeing in part, the story is told by the victors who got to build the temple of what they were seeing as identity. It's hard to even begin to answer that question. And we also don't know, this is really important, we don't know how much of this is the fanciful, oh, I want the world to look like this, versus this is what actually happened. And so this is a historical book in the way that it's written. We don't know how much of this is history. Other kinds of questions?
If not,
then I'm going to do one last piece, again, reminding you that in fact, this is the 13th day of the Omer. Next week on the 26th at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, on this same Zoom link, Rabbi Gidon Isaacs of Temple Anshe Shalom in Bethel in Indiana and Illinois, and Suzanne Griffel from Sinai Temple in Michigan City, Indiana. They will be presenting on the book of Ecclesiastes. So bring your very thoughtful questions to them, because they will dazzle you with the fun of Ecclesiastes.